Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class on the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a bittersweet day today. You know why that is? Because this is the final lesson of our class. Yes, all good things must come to an end. So we have now approached the conclusion of our class, which began back in January. You all have persevered. I'm proud of you. Thank you for returning to the class. We will wrap it up today with the discussion on the concluding chapters of Michael Ward's book on Planet Narnia. That's the plan for today. But you know me, I love trivia, so we got to start with some Narnia trivia. So what I've done is I've selected side characters from the Chronicles of Narnia, and I want to see how well do you know the side characters within these books. So take a minute. Look at these 10 different characters, and you can see I've told you here at the end of each line what book they come from. So Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian. So you try to identify the names of the characters described in each line. Let's see how you do. All right, should we look at these together? Let's do it. Number 1, what's the name of the captain of the White Witch's secret police? Mogram, that's right, he's a wolf. That's why Peter, who slayed him, got the name Sir Peter Wolfsbane, because he killed Mogram, the captain of the White Witch's secret police. Number 2, when Aslan takes Lucy and Susan to the witch's castle to depetrify everyone, they meet a giant who had been turned to stone by the White Witch, and he's restored by Aslan. What is that giant's name? This is tough. This is a tough one. Rumblebuffin. Rumblebuffin. Who would know that, right? Okay, yeah. Number 3. This one you might have a better chance of knowing. Prince Caspian's half-human, half-dwarf tutor. Dr. Cornelius. That's right. Very good. Who also makes an appearance in the movie Prince Caspian. All right, number 4. The name of the governor of the Lone Islands, who was then deposed by Caspian in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This one's tougher, too. I tried to pick a mix of like easier and harder ones. Governor Gumpas, Gumpas. All right, number 5. At the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, what sailor gets left behind on Ramondu's island? This is the one who got left behind, and then he spent the rest of his days in Calormen, bragging about how he made it to the end of the world, even though he didn't join the voyage that far. His name was Pittencream. Pittencream. All right, number 6. What's the name of the owl who carries Jill and Eustace to the Parliament of Owls at the beginning of the Silver Chair? Glimfeather. Glimfeather. All right, number 7. Here's another. This is a really tough one. What's the name of the stag at the end of The Horse and His Boy who warns Narnia of the Calormene invasion coming to Anvard in Archenland? Chervy, Chervy. What are we batting right now? I don't know. Okay, these are hard, I know. All right, number 8. What's the name of Diggory's aunt, or the sister of Uncle Andrew, in The Magician's Nephew? Her name was Letty. Letty, short for Letitia. All right, number 9. Okay, these are some like more main characters, so don't let me down here. All right, what is the name of the unicorn friend of King Tyrion in the last battle? Jewel. Good, we got one. All right, Jewel. And how about the centaur friend of King Tyrion, the one who's slain at Cair Paravel? Runewit. Runewit. Very good. All right, we did okay. Okay. All right. So those are my final trivia questions for you for the class. So there you go. Just to recap, if you have missed any of the lessons from this class, fret not, because they've all been recorded and uploaded to the YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and look for River Oaks Academy. That is the name of our YouTube channel, and they're all getting uploaded there. And so this shows you the key themes from each book that we have covered throughout this class. So we had 3 or 4 key themes that we highlighted from each book. And of course, there are plenty of other key themes we could have addressed as well. But, because of time constraints, this is what we focused on. So it's on your printout as well, so you can review those. You can go back to the previous lessons if you want to cover that material. But that's a lot of ground that we've covered this trimester. In addition to the key themes from the books, we also used the book Planet Narnia by Michael Ward, which has really revolutionized Narnia studies over the past 15 or so years. And you remember what his argument was? That each book symbolizes one of the medieval planets, the god associated with that planet. And so those themes informed the way Lewis created a particular atmosphere for each book. We called that the Donegality of each book. So let's see how well you remember those planets. Do you remember which planet goes with each book? Let's just go one by one. So, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, what's the planet? Jupiter. How about Prince Caspian? Mars. Voyage of the Dawn Treader? The Sun. That one's an easy one, I think. The Silver Chair? The Moon. The Horse and His Boy? Mercury. And the Magician's Nephew? Venus. And then last battle? Saturn. So there you go. According to Michael Ward, those planets inform the atmosphere and the writing style, the literary themes, and the Christological message of each book in the Chronicles of Narnia. So here is how Michael Ward summarizes the lesson learned from each book in his slimmer volume, The Narnia Code, which is a more popular level version of his Planet Narnia book. And so he says that in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children become kings and queens under the royal crown of Jupiter. So Jupiter symbolizes kingliness and joy. In Prince Caspian, they become knights and forest folk under the wooden shield of Mars. So Mars, of course, is the god of war. So all the virtues associated with that, like courage and chivalry, are expressed in this book. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which connects with the sun, they drink light and slay dragons under the sun's golden embrace. So remember, like the sun produces gold, but what creature is attracted to gold? Dragons. And so we see like dragons getting slain in this book, or transformed in the case of Eustace. In the Silver Chair, they avoid lunacy, so the word lunatic, from lunar, and reflect truth beneath the mirroring moon. So who is it that becomes a lunatic every evening in the Silver Chair? That's Prince Rilian, right? The one who is imprisoned by the Lady of the Green Kirtle in Underland. In The Horse and His Boy, they learn true speech. So, Hermes or Mercury is the messenger god. So they learn true speech under the living and active word of Mercury. And there's also that theme of division and recombination, you remember, like Quicksilver works. In The Magician's Nephew, they witness creation, laugh, and learn to love the morning star. So that chapter was covered by Pete Hansen. And then finally, the last battle. This chapter was covered by Morgan. Under Saturn's awful and awful influence, they learn the final lesson. Blessed are those who die in the Lord. So you can see how each book expresses these planetary themes and the symbolism there. Okay. We also use this chart, which I created to kind of summarize the Planet Narnia thesis in like one screen. So you can review that. With each chapter of Ward's book, we looked at how these qualities are woven into the storyline of each book. So we don't have to repeat all that. You can go back to the previous lessons. Here's what I want to do today, though. We're going to get into some new material in the concluding chapters of Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia. First, we're going to explore the question of the occasion of the writing of the Chronicles of Narnia. That is, what is it that inspired Lewis to write a children's fantasy series? This is the first time he'd done this in his career. What motivated him to do that? And then we're going to address some of the objections to the Planet Narnia thesis. So if you ask C.S. Lewis scholars today what their opinion is on the Planet Narnia thesis, opinions are divided. Many of them do now heartily embrace the Planet Narnia thesis, but many are still skeptical. And I suspect that might be the case with all of you as well. So we're going to look at some of the objections that people might raise to this thesis. But we'll begin with the question of the occasion of writing. And here's how Michael Ward puts the question himself. What was it that first moved Lewis to write in this way? Why should a childless academic in his 50s, without any previous experience of writing so-called children's literature, have taken this turn? So do you guys know what kind of works did Lewis write before the Chronicles of Narnia? That's right. So professionally, he was a specialist in medieval and Renaissance European literature. And so a lot of his writings were in the field of like literary criticism. He also did try his hand at some fiction, but not yet children's fiction. Do any of you know what fiction works he'd written before the Chronicles of Narnia? That's right, the Space Trilogy. That was written in like the 40s, whereas the Chronicles of Narnia was written in the 50s, like from 1950 to 56. Pilgrim's Regress was his first work of fiction. That's one that I have not yet read. I hear it's less popular among C.S. Lewis fans, but it's still worth looking at. So, Screw Tape. That's right. He also wrote the Screw Tape letters before Chronicles of Narnia. In addition to a lot of nonfiction works. So, the BBC broadcast that would eventually become Mere Christianity, or The Abolition of Man, which is probably my personal favorite of his nonfiction works. So it's a variety of topics. He did cultural commentary, he did some philosophy, he did literary criticism. And in his fiction, he did science fiction, he did allegory, but not yet children's literature. So this was a new turn for Lewis. Why would he have taken this turn at this point in his career? Well, it might be helpful to know what was the book he wrote immediately before the Chronicles of Narnia. This book, called Miracles, was the book he had written most recently. Does anybody know this book, or has anyone read this book? Okay, so this is another classic work of C.S. Lewis, very influential, and in this book, he explains one of the arguments that persuaded him to move towards a theistic worldview. His argument, part of the larger argument for his defense of miracles, was the idea that a materialistic worldview cannot account for the fact of reason itself. Because think of this. What if it's true that our minds are just molecules in motion, and that they evolved through non-rational processes of natural selection, survival of the fittest, so that they are just highly evolved primate brains? That means that our brains were not developed for the purpose of discovering and understanding the truth, but helping us to survive and reproduce. So we have no rational basis for accepting the truth claims that we hold in our mind, including the truth claims about materialism and evolution and so forth. So it is a self-refuting worldview. Has anybody ever heard an argument like this before? It's pretty popular among Christian apologists. But you cannot have reason unless there is a divine reason that transcends this created world and empowers the human mind to discover the truth. That's one of the central arguments within this book. I think it's a great argument. I love that argument, and we may come back to that idea later on in a future class. But this book was very influential, and it shows Lewis's own particular expertise in Christian apologetics. Even though that wasn't his professional training, again, he was a literary critic in medieval literature, but he was a very careful thinker, and he knew how to express himself very clearly and persuasively for a popular audience. It also happened to be the case that Lewis, during this time, I think, if I remember right, I think he was still at Cambridge at this time. I don't think he'd yet... was it Oxford? Because I think he went from Oxford to Cambridge, unless I'm switching that. Sorry, it's not too relevant right now. But at this point in his career, he was the president of the Socratic Club, which was a group of academics and philosophers who would meet regularly, and they would do debates on different topics. And there was a particular week early in 1948 where he was defending the thesis of his book on miracles. One of the people that was present and engaged in the debate with him was a young philosopher by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe. She was not a skeptic, not an atheist. She was a Roman Catholic. But she was skeptical of the way Lewis had presented his argument in the book Miracles. And most people would agree she won that debate. And the biographers of Lewis have mixed ways of evaluating what was Lewis's personal reaction to losing that debate. Here's how one biographer put it. So the biographer named A.N. Wilson argues that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe grew out of Lewis's experience of being stung back into childhood by his defeat at the hands of Elizabeth Anscombe. He thinks that Lewis was so shaken by the debate that he became a child, a little boy who was being degraded and shaken by a figure who, in his imagination, took on witch-like dimensions. So Wilson makes the argument that she was the inspiration for the White Witch. What can I say about that? I'm not convinced of this argument. Now, Wilson is not the only one who has made this argument. Others have tried to make that argument as well, that
This debate was just so devastating to Lewis that he gave up on the task of apologetics and reoriented his career towards children's literature. So it was sort of like a coping mechanism. He felt like a child after losing this debate. And so he took consolation and comfort in just writing children's literature, which was so much safer and encouraging than the hard academic work of Christian apologetics. So yeah, here's one of the reasons why I'm not so persuaded of this argument was the thing that she was critiquing Lewis on was not his central argument. It was one of the supporting arguments about the nature of causation, the way he kind of equivocated on the meaning of rational versus irrational, or the difference between irrational and non-rational. It's a very subtle difference. It would probably go over the heads of most people. But, if you really do press into the logical analysis, I think she had a point, and Lewis acknowledged that one of his supporting arguments wasn't worded carefully enough. It did not destroy the argument of the book, though, by any means. And to say that it traumatized him so much that he gave up on apologetics entirely is really a bit melodramatic. And I just don't think fits the actual events described. There is a great YouTube video on this topic by a friend of mine, Gavin Ortland. He has a YouTube channel called Truth Unites, with a lot of helpful Christian and Protestant apologetics material on that website. Last year, back in November, he did a video on the topic of the Lewis-Anscombe debate, and he is making the case that Wilson and other biographers who argue that Lewis retreated to children's literature because of this defeat, they have misunderstood what actually happened, and that argument does not hold water. And Gavin gives 3 evidences for that to be the case. First, he says, there's no evidence from the event itself that Lewis came to reject his apologetics work. Anscombe herself, as she recounted that debate, she saw Lewis to be sober-minded and thoughtful about it, but it wasn't like he was utterly dejected by any means. And people who knew Lewis at the time, they would not have characterized it that way either. Yes, he was discouraged, having lost the debate, but it was more so a pastoral concern that those who think that one particular argument for God's existence doesn't work would cause them to doubt whether God exists. Which, okay, I get that concern, right? That's a valid pastoral concern. I have concerns like that when I can't express myself clearly enough, to my students when I'm trying to present an argument for God's existence. So I get that. But it doesn't cause me to question the validity of apologetics per se. Also, if you look at the chronology of Lewis's career, this is Gavin's second argument, it shows that Lewis did not reject apologetics. He continued doing apologetics works after this debate. So I'm currently reading a collection of essays by C.S. Lewis called God in the Dock. And it shows a lot of these essays were written after this debate, later in his career. He was still very much engaged in the work of Christian apologetics. It was after this debate that he took his BBC broadcasts during World War II and turned them into the book we now know as Mere Christianity. This was published after that debate. And also, he didn't just chuck his book Miracles as a result of this debate. He revised it. This is one of the only works that he subjected to a substantial revision, and he republished Miracles in 1960. And the chapter that Anscombe had critiqued, he revised it considerably in order to respond to her critiques. That shows us he did not give up on that argument entirely. He responded to the critique and improved his argument to make it a more effective case. So again, I don't think any of this shows that Lewis was just retreating to children's literature as a coping mechanism for having lost this debate. And then lastly, Gavin makes the argument, a turn from apologetics to children's literature is an artificial and mechanical view of literary production. That's just not the way minds work. If you look at how authors come up with their literary works, you cannot reduce it to one single event or cause. We know that Lewis, he had images of a fawn carrying parcels under a lamppost. Those images were in his mind from his teenage years. He was intending to turn that into a story at some point. And that was well before this debate ever happened. So the argument that Lewis was using the Chronicles of Narnia as sort of a comfort because of his failure in apologetics, it just does not hold water. And I don't think it gives Lewis enough credit as an apologist or as a children's fiction author. But Ward does argue that debate did influence the Chronicles of Narnia in a particular way. Here's Ward's argument. He says, Lewis, I submit, turned to romance, and here not like love stories, but like fantasy is how the word usually was originally meant. He turned to romance not as a retreat from apologetics after his debate with Anscombe, but precisely as a way of explaining his case to himself in imaginative form. This is interesting. Ward is arguing that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in particular is an imaginative presentation of the same philosophical argument presented in Miracles. That's a pretty fascinating case. Ward goes on to say, readers participate in a story which is the romance equivalent of the philosophical and theological argument advanced in Miracles. They enjoy his fiction, that vision of the world which Lewis had tried to make contemplatable in his apologetics. Do you remember we've talked about this distinction between enjoyment and contemplation, the two modes of knowledge? You might remember we referenced his essay, Meditation in a Tool Shed, where he distinguishes between looking along the beam and looking at the beam. So there's sort of like a abstract knowledge versus an experiential knowledge. And so if the book Miracles is about an abstract knowledge of the truth of God, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia are inviting us into a more experiential knowledge, to enjoy God's presence. And so it's making the same argument, but in a different mode of knowledge. That's an interesting case. Now, Ward is speculating here, and he admits that. He believes that this theory is not as compelling to him personally as his Planet Narnia thesis. But he thinks it does make sense, and it makes better sense than a lot of the other alternative theories proposed for why Lewis decided to write the Chronicles of Narnia when he did. Okay, now we're going to move into some of the objections that might be raised to the Planet Narnia thesis. And we have 4 of them that we'll look at, and these are the 4 objections that Ward addresses in his concluding chapters of Planet Narnia. To begin with, he addresses the objection, are the Chronicles really just intellectual constructions? That is, are they simply vehicles for communicating the symbolism of the medieval planets? If we buy his thesis, doesn't that reduce the value of what these books are doing? Was Lewis really just intending to communicate planetary symbolism in a playful way through the medium of children's literature? What do you guys think? Does it somehow impoverish the Chronicles of Narnia if Lewis was intending to use them as symbols of the medieval planets? I don't know if I would say that. I would say it enriches them, if anything. I think it gives us a deeper level of understanding of what he's doing in these books. In addition to all of the wisdom and the beauty that we see in the books already, even apart from the Planet Narnia thesis, this just makes the books a whole lot cooler, doesn't it? I mean, that's what I would say. I don't think it detracts from the value of these books by any means. Here's what Ward says. Lewis, as allegorist, could initially adopt in a magistral, that is like a teacher mode way, a symbolic system, and then right within that symbolic system in a pupillary or student mode way. So the arguments made in this book do not require us to acknowledge only an allegorizing intellect at work in the Narniad. Rather, we are claiming that Lewis's allegorizing intellect and symbolic imagination were mutually and fruitfully engaged. So once he had the planetary framework in mind, his imagination took off from there, and there's so much more that he could do in these books. You can't reduce it to that planetary framework, but that was the starting point for the writing of these books, according to Ward's thesis, at least. Objection number 2. This one I think carries a little bit more weight. I can understand, this is a significant objection. Why is the scheme not more perfect? Let me give you some examples here of where it looks like the Planet Narnia theory doesn't quite work perfectly. Why, for instance, does the word lunatic appear not only in The Silver Chair, but also twice in The Magician's Nephew? And why does that same book contain the word quicksilver, a mercurial vestige? I noticed that as I was rereading The Magician's Nephew as well. As a Fledge, the Pegasus, was flying them westward to retrieve the apple, that's Diggory and Polly, they notice a river winding like quicksilver underneath them as they're flying westward. It's the only time you see the word quicksilver in that book, and you never see the word quicksilver in The Horse and His Boy. If that's a mercurial book, why would one book have the word, and the book that's supposed to be mercurial doesn't have that word? It's a good question. And why is lead mentioned in the Dawn Treader, but not in the Last Battle? Remember that there's a different metal associated with each planet, and the the metal of Saturn is lead, which is the planet associated with the last battle. But lead is not present in the last battle. And also, if the military events in Prince Caspian are deemed to be martial, why not those in the last battle? I mean, there's more battling going on in the last battle. I mean, the word battle is in the title, as opposed to Prince Caspian. So why would Prince Caspian be the martial book and not the last battle? It looks like the system doesn't quite fit perfectly if we're going by the themes of each medieval planet. That's the objection. Here's what Ward has to say. He gives a few different arguments in response. First, he does observe that in the medieval system, the planets do tend to intermingle. One planet can serve to represent another planet, and that can happen on occasion. So we shouldn't like strictly compartmentalize the planets. Okay, the planets as a whole contain a whole system of symbolism, and sometimes one planet can do the work for other planets. The second argument is words must be read in their context. So take a concept like battle or war. Yes, that can be a martial theme, but it can also be a Saturnine theme. Because in the last battle, what is war? What's the purpose of the descriptions of the warfare? Well, it's to communicate the tragedy and death and disaster. The purpose of the descriptions of battles in the last battle is to communicate that note of despair and grieving and tragedy. It's not meant to communicate the martial virtues like courage or perseverance and so forth. Those are more it's true those themes are there to a lesser extent, but they're much more foregrounded in Prince Caspian. Also, third, we have to acknowledge Lewis was a human, and he's not likely to have pulled off his project perfectly. Yes, even if he had this system in mind, we can't expect Lewis to have followed it perfectly, absolutely consistently throughout the entire Chronicles. And then lastly, Ward acknowledges that his own project itself is incomplete and invites a more detailed study. There are themes, planetary themes, that Ward might not have picked up on in these books. I think I did mention to you when I was teaching on the silver chair, I noticed a theme that I thought was lunar, which was, do you remember how Jill and Eustace, they muffed the signs? Remember Aslan gave Jill 4 signs? And I thought that corresponded to the lunar sphere of heaven in Dante's Paradiso, which is the sphere of the inconstant. That's those who had broken monastic vows or vows of celibacy, but for pardonable reasons. And I thought that the characters, muffing the signs that Aslan had given to them corresponded to this theme of inconstancy. And I even asked Ward about that, and he said, yeah, he thought that was right too. So there are other themes to be noticed there that were not identified in Planet Narnia. And so there is more work to be done on this topic. So those are some of Ward's ways of addressing that objection. Now we can look at objection number 3. If Lewis kept this scheme a secret, wouldn't it be better for us to do so as well? Wouldn't we sort of miss out on the mystery of it if we sort of spill the beans, let the cat out of the bag? I'm mixing my metaphors there. Shouldn't it just be left in the background? What do you guys think? Would it be better for us, even if that's what Lewis was trying to do? He also was intending to keep it a secret. So should we keep the secret too? I'm hearing a no. Yeah, that's a great point, John. If God himself is created a world for us to discover, wouldn't Lewis invite us to do the same? That's, I think, going to help us answer objection number 4 as well. Pete, did you want to add to that? Oh, yeah. I can only imagine the sheer delight that Ward must have felt when the light bulb switched on for him, right? All these pieces just come together in a flood. I didn't have time to tell the story of biographically how did Ward come to discover the Planet Narnia thesis, but he was doing doctoral work on C.S. Lewis at Oxford. And one evening he was reading through the section on the heavens in the book The Discarded Image, which we've discussed previously in this class. And then that inspired him to look at Lewis's poetic works on the planets. And then he read the poem The Planets, and that line about Jupiter, about guilt forgiven and the past, winter past and guilt forgiven, that's when the light bulb switched on for him. And everything just kind of fell into place after that for him. Just think of the joy that comes with a discovery like that. If Ward's thesis is correct, this is one of the most important, probably the most important literary discovery of our lifetime. It's that big of a deal. Yeah, Morgan? Gifts are wrapped to be opened. That is a great way to put it, Morgan. Let me show you what Michael Ward has to say about this objection. He says, part of the attractiveness, for example, of Mona Lisa's smile is its enigmatic quality. There is fun to be had in speculating what it means. The art critic who convincingly explained why she was smiling would take something away from the painting. However, the loss would surely be more than compensated for by gain. Knowledge, except where it is illicit, is always a kind of pleasure, and it is hard to see how our responses to Leonardo and to the Mona Lisa would not be enriched if we could read the silent message in her lips. I think it's the same way. Yes, there's sort of a loss that comes with unlocking this hidden code in the Chronicles of Narnia, but it's more than compensated by the delight we find in just all these planetary connections that we can now make in reading these books. Here's the last one, and which I find to be the strongest objection to the Planet Narnia thesis. If this is what Lewis was intending to do with his books, why did he not tell anyone, even to his dying day? Why did he not disclose the secret? What do you think? I mean, there's not a letter, not a comment. Nobody remembers anything of Lewis giving away this secret. We get some hints there that maybe he was intending to do something like this, but nothing obvious, nothing clear. If he was trying to do this, why don't we see him saying it? Artists don't always communicate everything to their audience about what they're intending to do in their work. That's the job of the viewer or the reader, the audience. And Ward makes that same point. Lewis was of the belief that what the reader is made to do for himself has a particular importance. And he evidently considered the planetary secret to be something that should be won, not given away. The very process of winning it would engender in the discoverer certain responses that could not arise if the design were announced by the designer. Isn't it so much more satisfying to know that, Ward, but we figured it out without Lewis having to tell us? It's like unlocking a code. It's putting together a puzzle for yourself. This is what I try to do with my students, right? I want them to discover the truth for themselves. Yes, I can just spoon feed them the answers, but something is lost when that's what you're trying to do. And so I think there's something more rewarding about us figuring it out for ourselves without Lewis having to tell us. And there's more to it, and I think this goes back to what John's comment was previously. It has to do with this theme of divine hiddenness and how that theme expresses itself in C.S. Lewis's writings. Here's what Ward has to say. When a Russian cosmonaut claimed not to have found evidence of God in outer space, was that Yuri Gagarin? Am I right about that? Remember, I think it was like the first Russian in outer space. He looked in outer space and said, "There's no God here. I don't see a God here." Lewis's response was, "Well, much depends on the seeing eye." Not that he believed divinity to be in the eye of the beholder. On the contrary, he believed the eye of the beholder to be in the divinity for sight and insight. For sight and insight were created, sustained, and redeemed or not redeemed by God. Remember that argument I just made a few minutes ago from his book Miracles about how reason itself requires a divine mind and that a materialistic worldview cannot account for our capacity for reason? Lewis is making the same observation here in this idea that we depend upon divinity for insight. And so, just because you look into outer space and you don't see God, well, it's because you're looking in the wrong way. You're asking the wrong kind of question. Why can you see in the first place is a better question. But we do, nevertheless, see this theme of divine hiddenness. God does not display himself overtly, explicitly in the created world. Now, the created world is a testimony to God. That's the doctrine of general revelation. But God could make himself clearer, and yet does not. And in fact, the Bible tells us about that. So Isaiah 45:15 says, "Truly you are a God who hides himself." Jesus, when talking about why he teaches in parables, tells the disciples, "For those outside, everything is in parables." Why? So that seeing they might not understand, or hearing they might not perceive. So the idea there is that there is a purpose to the divine hiddenness. And Lewis himself might be trying to imitate that same quality in his writings, which was the exact point that John was talking about. Ward says these sorts of considerations, it may be supposed, provided Lewis with a reason to keep silence about his Narnian secret. He was following an example given by the divine author. Now, there is another possibility as well, and this is how Ward concludes this chapter. But perhaps that is to overstate the seriousness of Lewis's intentions. Maybe he was just conducting a playful literary experiment, curious to know whether his readers would recognize the Chronicles' symbolic structure, that structure in which, with consummate irony, a willfully discarded image of the cosmos is used to symbolize God's willfully concealed presence. Maybe he just didn't want to let the cat out of the bag. Maybe he was having fun with it. Maybe he wanted us to have fun with it as well, the fun of the discovery for ourselves. That could be it. It would be a really elaborate system to have done the entire thing subconsciously. I mean, just look at the way, like, we see the themes of division and recombination in The Horse and His Boy, the word paleness occurring over and over again in the silver chair. That looks deliberate to me. Yeah, Pete? Why 7 books? Yes, that's right. Now, initially he was debating whether or not to go with 3. He even considered 9. At one point in his writings, he says, it could also be, though, there were actually spheres beyond the planetary heavens, though, too. So it could be he was thinking maybe I could have like a book for the stars and a book for the primum mobile, I think is the highest heaven. So, yeah. He did settle on 7, though, for a reason. And he says once he reached the number 7, he completed his project. He was satisfied with the number 7. Why was 7 so special? And different Lewis scholars have speculated about that. He wanted 7 on purpose. Some have thought that maybe it's because of the 7 deadly sins, or maybe the 7 classical virtues, or the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, even though he wasn't Catholic. But I think Ward figured it out. I think Ward gives us the best explanation of anyone so far. But I'd like to know what you guys think. What's your verdict? Are you guys convinced of the planet Narnia theory? Do you think that Lewis is trying to communicate the symbolism of each medieval planet with these books? Let me try and take a show of hands. How many of you think you're fairly convinced? At least more than 50% convinced of the theory. Okay, that's a pretty good number. How many of you are either on the fence or you're thinking, no, not so much? Okay, so there's a couple here. All right. So it looks like the ayes have it. All right, well, let me tell you what we got planned for the future. How many of y'all would like another class on C.S. Lewis? Okay, well, I'm thinking that for the year 2025, I'll put together another C.S. Lewis class for his works beyond the Chronicles of Narnia. These are some of Lewis's other fictional works. So I'm roughly going in chronological order here, top row. Pilgrim's Regress was his first work of fiction as a Christian. And then there's his space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. And I think sometime during when he wrote the trilogy, he also wrote the Screwtape Letters. And then later comes The Great Divorce. And then comes his last work of fiction, which is also, in his opinion, and probably my opinion, his greatest work of fiction, Till We Have Faces. Those are some of the other books that we could explore in a Sunday school class on C.S. Lewis. And if what I have in mind tentatively, for this class, we did 2 weeks per book. We did a week analyzing the book itself, and then a week on Ward's corresponding chapter. Perhaps for this next class, we could just do 1 book per week. And so that would be what? There's 7 works there, so that's 7 weeks. And then maybe we could add some of his nonfiction works as well, like Mere Christianity, The Abolition of Man, Miracles, an experimenting criticism. We'll see. That's kind of what I have in mind, though. So we'll go beyond the Chronicles of Narnia to see what else Lewis has to say, what wisdom we can learn from him. So that's my idea. What do you guys think? So, you want me to slow down then? We could maybe just take a whole trimester and just stick with the fiction and do 2 weeks per book. Is that the preference then? Okay. All right. Okay, well, I'm glad, because I was going to ask for feedback on this idea. So, all right, maybe we'll do 1 book for every 2 weeks, and we'll go at a more deliberate pace. And then maybe we'll do a separate series for the nonfiction. There we go. Okay, well, I like that idea too, so maybe we'll go with that. So let me conclude this class. So we've been doing this since January. We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered all the Chronicles and Michael Ward's book. That is a lot of material. I want to know what you think about this class overall, especially those of you who've been here from the beginning. What did you like most about this class? What would you change about this class, and what would you want in future classes? Well, I could talk with our student director, Heath, so he's our new student director here, and so the good news is I have already built the curriculum for him because these are now all on YouTube. So that's not a bad idea. I would love to have our students exposed to this material as well. Maybe we could cut out the Michael Ward lessons. I mean, that's still pretty cool, but I mean, that's more like icing on the cake, right? But really just to like the weeks that were dedicated to the books themselves and the Chronicles, at a minimum, I think that would be beneficial for the students, I think. Yeah. It is really helpful to be able to evaluate these books from a Christian worldview. So that is one of the primary goal of this class, was to be able to glean from Lewis's wisdom, but evaluate it from, a Christian framework, which is not hard to do because that's what he was intending to do. So we're just cooperating with his intention. Right. And I think that's true of just like literary analysis in general, right? To study any work of literature, you have to be rooted in a biblical worldview. You have to know the basics of Christian doctrine first so that you have that framework to evaluate. I remember, I read, not the entire Space Trilogy, I read That Hideous Strength in college as I was in the middle of apostatizing. There is so much that I missed out on because I just didn't have the Christian worldview to make sense of what Lewis was doing in that book, which is why I'm looking forward to this future C.S. Lewis class when I can go back and now I'll have the incentive to reread that book, but now that I'm a Christian, I'll be able to read it in a new light. So yeah, just having that foundation in like Christian doctrine and a biblical worldview is key. That needs to come first, absolutely. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. So one final thing I do want to say. I want to express my hearty thanks to our ruling elders, Pete Hansen and Morgan Murphy, with their help teaching this class. Because if I had to do all the work on my own, I would have burned out in February. So I am very grateful for the support that they've provided, as well as John Hodges, who I don't think is here right now, but he was a big help as well when he did the silver chair. So I am very appreciative for the help that I've received for this class, and I'm appreciative of you as well for continuing to come back to hear these classes. So thank you so much. Can I conclude our time in prayer? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the gift of C.S. Lewis and the way you equipped that man to communicate Christian truth to such a wide audience. And we thank you for his legacy, and we thank you that we today can learn from his wisdom. And we pray, Lord, that we would take these ideas, know how to filter them and evaluate them through a biblical framework, through a Christian worldview, so that we could be encouraged, that we could be sanctified, and that we could be inspired to see your truth and your goodness and your beauty everywhere. And we pray, Lord, that our lives would exhibit that same truth and goodness and beauty in all that we do. We love you, Lord, and we give you the glory. In Christ's name. Amen. Thank you, everyone.